go. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm Ari Eisenstadt. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I actually work for the Audubon Naturalist Society in the conservation department. I'm the DC Conservation Advocate, which means that I work on Washington, DC's climate policies and issues of environmental justice. And I work on DC's policies as a city, not as the seat of the federal government. So it's a lot of fun. And there are some of you on the call right now who I work with pretty frequently. And for those who I don't already, I hope that you'll send me an email, tweet me, etc., and we can start working together. And for reference, here's my email address. It's ari.eisenstadt@anshome.org. And if you feel like tweeting me either during or after the presentation, my Twitter handle is EisenstadtAri. Okay, so before we formally begin, I want to introduce something that's going to be sort of going on throughout the presentation, which is that I'm going to be talking about a set of key concepts. And when I have a key concept to share, it'll say key concept on it, and I've numbered them. And I certainly don't want anybody to feel like they have to take notes. And so we're going to refer back to these frequently, but they're really helpful pieces of science, basic science that help one understand the ocean and chemistry and biology more clearly. And as Sarah said, if at any point you feel confused or just have a question or are curious about something and want me to expand, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll have frequent opportunities for Sarah to send those questions over to me so I can answer them. So first off, we're going to start with some climate change basics. And to do that, we first have to meet these two friends of ours. And I say friends because they're not inherently bad, but they are when we burn them, which is what humans are doing nowadays in the form of fossil fuels. And so we have on the left-hand side methane, on the right-hand side, we've got carbon dioxide. And both methane and carbon dioxide are examples of greenhouse gases, and they contribute measurably along with a couple other smaller gases to climate change. And today our talk is mainly going to focus on carbon dioxide. Methane does interact a lot with the ocean, and that's actually most of what I've done in research back in graduate school was working on methane dynamics. But carbon dioxide is the most abundant of the two in the atmosphere, and it's what we emit the most of, and it's also the most of what the ocean interacts with in terms of greenhouse gases. Okay, so this is our first key concept, and it's the concept of concentration. This is a concept that's pretty crucial to talking about chemistry, talking about climate change, talking about the ocean, and all sorts of things having to do with nature. And so the basic definition is that concentration describes the amount of a substance present in a defined unit of space, and that unit of space can be in a defined volume, it can be in a jar, it can be in a bottle, it can be in something as big as the ocean or as the atmosphere. And so the example that I have on the right is these bottles. So let's pretend that since we're at a nature talk right now, that these bottles are made of 100% post-consumer recycled plastic, or that they're 100% compostable in backyard composting buckets, just so that we're all kosher right now. So let's imagine that these bottles, the one on the left is a 1 liter soda bottle, and it's got a bunch of water in it, as soda does, and it also has 40 grams of sugar, which is just about the normal for something like a Pepsi. And so now we want to say, okay, what is the concentration of sugar in this 1 liter bottle? So the total amount of the space in the bottle is 1 liter, and we have 40 grams of sugar. So there's 40 grams per total liter of liquid, and that equals, in concentration notation, 40 grams per liter. And that's what you see on the second bullet point, 40 G/L. When you see a slash, usually with 2 letters, on either side. That is shorthand for per. So 40 grams per, or for every liter. And then we can also say, okay, what about the same amount of sugar in a 2-liter bottle? Concentration is dependent on the overall size of the space that you're talking about. And so if we have 40 grams in 2 liters, it's 40 grams per 2 liters. And using some math that I think many of us probably learned in school about, reducing fractions down to their smallest common denominator, that turns into 20 grams per liter. Okay, does anybody have any questions about concentration? Okay, doesn't seem like it. Awesome.
Yeah, no questions right now.
Great. All right. So key concept number 2 goes hand in hand with concentration. And it's a way of expressing concentration, and it's called parts per million. And it's a type of notation. It's basically a unit, or just a really fancy way of talking about a tiny, tiny fraction. And it describes the concentration of gases, usually, that are present in a larger space. And this is particularly useful when we're talking about the atmosphere or the ocean, for example. And an example that I think some of us are probably familiar with is gas tanks, such as a propane tank. And in this example, we're going to talk about this hypothetical gas tank on the left. And we're going to say, all right, this gas tank can fit 1 million molecules of gas. And those molecules can be anything. And in this example, 100 of those molecules, we're going to say that they're oxygen, and the rest of them are nitrogen. That's sort of the basic composition of air around us, not in these exact proportions, but most air is made up of oxygen and nitrogen and a couple other things. So now we want to know, okay, what's the concentration of oxygen in the tank in parts per million? So similar to what we did with our bottle of soda, we're going to take the number of parts of the substance we're talking about, which is 100 oxygen molecules, and then the total space, which is 1 million molecules. So there's 100 oxygen molecules existing in a space that can fit 1 million other molecules. And so the concentration in parts per million of oxygen then becomes 100 parts per million, which is ppm. So that's the shorthand for parts per million. And then we're also going to say, okay, what about the concentration of nitrogen? And this is an interesting one because the concentration would be a number we really don't need to express in something like parts per million. It would be 990,000 parts per million. And if we get that big, we don't really even need to use this kind of notation anymore, because we would also want to simplify down to the smallest common denominator. And that would end up being, 99 over 100. So 99% basically. All right. I see some activity in the chat, so I'm going to just check, see if there's any 1 million less. Oh, yep. Sorry about that. That was a, thank you, Scott. Math error. I am not a math major. It should be 999,900. Thank you, Scott. Okay. Let's go on to this next one. Okay. So the concentration and parts per million discussion becomes particularly relevant when we're talking about carbon dioxide. And there's a lot of talk about the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now. And I want to sort of rewind 800,000 years or so to a time when mammoths roamed the earth, and there were ice ages, etc. And so this data on the graph that you can see is the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide for the past 800,000 years. And scientists got this data from drilling into glaciers and ice sheets, which are made of frozen seawater, basically, and then analyzing the carbon dioxide that's trapped in tiny little bubbles in this ice. And that creates what's called a vision of what's called paleo, meaning ancient, paleoclimate. And so paleoclimate data from ice cores tells us that there are natural variations in the cycling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and in the concentration. But what we're seeing right now is completely unprecedented. You know, since the Industrial Revolution it began in the mid 1800s, concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have shot up significantly and are higher than at any point in history. The highest previous concentration in the past 800,000 years was 300 parts per million. And at the time that this graphic was produced, it was 407.4 parts per million. So we know something is up. And because this data was gathered from ice, we know that there has to be some interaction between the atmosphere and water because ice is frozen water. And the ice that has been studied to produce these graphs is frozen seawater. And so this sort of begins to give us a clue that, you know, we need to look at the oceans to see kind of what's going on. So just to add on to the discussion about the current concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, this is a screenshot that I took just yesterday of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's carbon dioxide monitoring page. And you can see data from November 2019 showing that the concentration in the atmosphere on average was about 410 parts per million. And just a year later, it's gone up. November 2020 was 412 parts per million. And so this is pretty par for the course in what we've been seeing over the past, 240 or so years, is that on average, even though there are seasonal variations that you can see on the two graphs on the bottom, on average, atmospheric carbon dioxide has been continuing to rise and will continue to do so as long as we use fossil fuels. And because of some of the relationships that I'm going to talk about, carbon dioxide will continue to rise in the atmosphere even long after we've stopped burning fossil fuels. Okay, so now we're going to get to key concept number 3, which is really important in understanding the behavior of the ocean relative to the atmosphere. And that concept is sources and sinks. And you can think of this kind of like vacuums and leaf blowers, where vacuums are sinks and leaf blowers are sources. And this graph shows us the total amount of fossil fuel emissions that have been released into the atmosphere by humans throughout the entire globe since 1960. And that's that top red line. And it goes up and up pretty much every year. And the total amount, the total mass, is measured in something called petagrams, spelled P-E-T-A. And that is a billion times a billion, essentially. It's 10 to the 15th. So you've got 15 zeros. Whoopsies. Sorry about that. We've got 15 zeros after that number. So we're at about 6 or 7 petagrams every year of carbon being released into the atmosphere. And the blue piece of this graph is where things get really interesting because it shows us, okay, of the fossil fuels that we're, of the carbon that we're emitting by burning fossil fuels, how much actually ends up in the atmosphere? And the green and yellow space in between that red line and the blue is curious because the blue doesn't match up with the red. And so there's something going on. There's something that's taking the carbon that we're emitting and sucking it out of the atmosphere so that the total accumulation of carbon dioxide is smaller than our emissions. And that is what is called a sink. So sources of carbon dioxide are fossil fuel emissions, concrete manufacturing, industry, et cetera, et cetera. And then sinks are things that suck it out, and that is what the ocean does. And that's also what the terrestrial biosphere, aka forested land, does. And so now we want to figure out, okay, what allows the ocean to be this carbon dioxide sink? So before I get there, I just want to see if we've got any questions, curiosities, anything. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat.
I do have one.
You do have one. Yay. Okay.
Go back to the chart. Okay.
This one?
Yes. So I see that around late 80s and late 90s, there was a really hard, and even
It's
late 70s, that is a pattern. So what what is happening that allows such a high rate of accumulation of carbon in those years?
yeah, that's a really interesting question. And part of it has to do with the El Nino cycle and the way that that affects the behavior of the oceans and the ocean's ability to take in carbon dioxide. And then there's also a really, really interesting big dip in the early 1990s. And I remember learning about this in college. The dip in the accumulation rate of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in that, I'm not sure if you can all see that sort of big one, is due to the giant emissions of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere from the explosion of Mount Pinatubo, which is a volcano in the Philippines. And sulfur dioxide has a really interesting relationship to carbon dioxide and the oceans. And it basically acts in the opposite way that carbon dioxide and methane do as greenhouse gases. And it helps cool things down, which is just fascinating. And so there's been a lot of research lately about whether or not, as a climate change mitigation tactic, we should just inject a bunch of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. And thankfully we haven't done that yet, because it could have really dire consequences in terms of increasing acid rain and stuff. But it's just, I think, incredible how a volcanic eruption is reflected on something as on such a huge scale as something like this chart.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're gonna go on to the specifics of what really allows the ocean to work its magic. Yes.
We have one more question from Claire.
Sure.
Could there be any relationship between the huge energy crisis in the mid-70s and the fossil fuel numbers?
Yes, that's exactly correct. The fossil fuel emissions and what accumulates in the atmosphere isn't quite as responsive to short scale stuff like energy crises, but emissions are responsive to that, sort of the emission levels. And that's something that we can see that is happening right now with the COVID-19 crisis, is that emissions have drastically declined. And all research points to the fact that emissions are going to shoot back up as soon as the pandemic is over and economies try to reboot themselves. There's usually actually an increase from the baseline in emissions after global crises, which isn't great, but we are going to see a pretty significant dip. And one of the things that is also reflected in that graph is the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had massive global impacts on economies and productivity. So I think it's a fascinating thing to think about, the way that humanity is mirrored in the natural world and vice versa. So Claire, thank you so much for bringing that up.
That is all for now.
Great. All right, so now we're going to go to key concept number 4, which is our last major concept that we're going to talk about that helps us piece together an understanding of the ocean and what allows it to be a vacuum for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this concept is one of concentration gradients. So I think probably many of us have heard of the term gradient. It describes a change, basically, over space, over time, over distance, anything like that. And in concentration gradients, it describes the difference in the amount and concentration of specific molecules on one side of a membrane relative to another side of a membrane. And that term membrane is basically just used to denote a divider. A membrane, we can think of a membrane as a fence. Sometimes that fence allows stuff through it. Sometimes the fence is more of a wall. And for fences that allow stuff through it, that's where concentration gradient becomes really important. Because if you have a fence that's pretty porous, it's got a lot of holes in it, it can let as much stuff through as it wants, basically. And on one side of the fence, you've got a lot of cows. Okay, let's imagine we're on a farm. And the cows are over here hanging out. And on this other side of the fence, you've only got 3 cows. And these cows are just chilling. They're eating all the grass they want. And over here, the 100 cows, they're getting kind of antsy and they're getting a little bit annoyed with each other. And they're saying, okay, we're going to go over and split up so that everybody can have more space. That's what happens with concentration gradients. When you have high concentrations of molecules on one side of a divider and low concentrations on another side, chemistry and thermodynamics has basically figured out the fact that that molecules always move from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration. And the difference between the concentrations on those sides of the divider is what is the concentration gradient. And the interesting piece about this is that there's energy stored in any molecule. And that energy and the difference between the concentration over here and over here is enough to actually move those molecules from one side to the other. They don't need an external push a lot of the time. And that's what happens in the ocean. And that's why concentration gradients are so important, because we know that there's carbon dioxide building up in the atmosphere. We're just pumping it in and pumping it in. And because there's this oceanic sink, that means that in order for the ocean to be absorbing carbon dioxide, there has to be a difference in the concentration. The ocean isn't just sitting there with, fish don't have little straws that they're, sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So something's got to be going on. And that something is this concentration gradient. And because molecules move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, we know that that means that there's got to be a low concentration in the surface of the ocean relative to the atmosphere so that the molecules can move from the atmosphere to the surface of the ocean. And now we get into some of the real meat, where we're talking about, okay, what drives these gradients? What is creating this difference? And this is primarily caused by 3 pumps, not literal pumps, but they're called pumps in chemical oceanography because they cause molecules to move from one area to the other. And the first thing that's creating this gradient is what's called the biological pump. So you got a bunch of algae in the ocean. They're photosynthesizing up the wazoo. They're taking in a lot of carbon dioxide. They're taking in a lot of nutrients. They're building their little green shells. And when they die, as all matter does, they sort of clump together, and bigger plankton, bigger algae, sometimes krill, other types of little friends, eat them. And when those organisms that are called zooplankton, when they poop, their poop balls together, and it's heavy enough that some of it sinks to the ground. And there's the carbon dioxide that was originally consumed by the algae back in the beginning in photosynthesis is still in that poop. And when the poop sinks all the way down to the ocean, that changes the amount of carbon dioxide that's stored in the bottom of the ocean. And that means that it's drawing down CO2, that helps create the low concentrations in the surface of the ocean because there are higher concentrations at the bottom of the ocean. And something similar happens with another mechanism that's much more based on physics than it is on biology. And that's called the solubility pump. And basically it has to do with how easy is it for carbon dioxide to dissolve in water. And for this, I like to think about soda. Back to the beginning, that liter bottle of soda that we put some sugar in it. Soda, as we know, is fizzy. And soda's fizzy because of carbon dioxide that gets injected into it. And I think many of us have probably had soda before that, we left out in the heat, it got flat. And then, also had soda that stayed fizzy for much, much longer when we put it in the fridge. And that's the same thing that happens with the ocean. We can think of the ocean as a giant soda can. And some areas of the ocean are colder than others, and some are hotter than others. And the colder places are really facilitate carbon dioxide staying in water, just like cold soda stays fizzy. The warmer places kind of tend to push out carbon dioxide, just like soda gets flat when it's out in the heat. And so that's what happens in the ocean, in that places that have, are better set up in the global oceans to absorb carbon dioxide are the ones that are colder. And that's why the majority of carbon dioxide is absorbed in the ocean in a space below 35 degrees latitude. And that's what is called the global southern ocean. And so that is really what helps get carbon dioxide. This solubility pump is responsible for absorbing about 70% of all of the carbon dioxide that the ocean can hold. And then it also, because colder water is heavier, it sinks. And the sun shines on the surface of the ocean, keeping it nice and warm, but then the sun can only shine so deep. And so that's what you can see in this picture, is that the deeper you go, the less the sun is able to warm the surface, and the cooler the water gets. And so cooler water sinks, and it takes with it the carbon dioxide that was dissolved into the surface, and it kind of traps it right down there. And that also helps to drive the difference in concentration between the surface of the ocean and the atmosphere. And all of these things keep that surface concentration lower than the concentration in the atmosphere, and allows that sort of that vacuum of carbon dioxide into the surface of the ocean. And then there's an interesting thing that happens with algae, in that while they do photosynthesize, they do use up a lot of carbon, they also tend to, in the short term, emit some carbon dioxide. And so we're not really going to focus a ton on the carbonate pump, except to say that we want to pay attention to both short-term and long-term timescales when we're talking about the ocean. And think about the fact that the biological pump and the solubility pump sort of band together to outweigh the short-term impacts of the carbonate pump on increasing carbon dioxide. And I see that we have some activity in the chat. And Sydney said, do hurricanes have an effect on oceanic carbon absorption? I haven't come across that particularly as a major driver of carbon absorption. Most of it happens from these three mechanisms. But what hurricanes can do, and this is what storms do in general, is they increase the surface area of the ocean that's in contact with the atmosphere. So I think on the on the short, in a sort of really small short time scale, they probably do encourage carbon dioxide to be absorbed, because it's just like how when you splash water, waves pop up, and that means that there's more actual surface of water that's touching the atmosphere on either side, and that means there's more space for carbon dioxide to be sucked in. So I hope that helps with hurricanes.
I would like to add that it's basically that increase in the mixing, right? It's different to compare a parcel of air that is just sitting there with a calm ocean versus the very vigorous mixing that is happening during a hurricane. This is also speculation, because you would have to also take into account the warmer temperature that facilitates an ocean to form, and how those two forces balance each other. But it is something for your brain to munch on. Thank you, Ari. We also have Christine Haggard that would like to know if the change in CO2 in oceans affect the creatures and plant life that exist there.
Absolutely. And Serenella, thank you for adding that part about mixing. Serenella has expertise that span every area of science. So she's able to
Every
answer things that I can't. Yeah. So thank you. And then to address that second question, absolutely. The increase in carbon dioxide has an extremely significant effect on creatures and plant life, and we're going to get there. So I'm going to save the answer to that question for later on in the presentation, except to say that yes, it does.
Wonderful. That's all for now.
Cool. Okay. So now we're going to get into some of the meat of not just how carbon dioxide, we talked about how carbon dioxide gets into the ocean in the first place, and it's because of that gradient. And another way to think of it is how my old college professor used to describe it to me, in that, think about if you have a perfume bottle, and you're standing in one corner of the room, and you squirt some perfume into this corner, and then you have somebody on the total opposite side of the room, and initially they're not going to smell the perfume, but once time goes on, the little tiny aerosol particles of your perfume are going to move from that corner where you squirted it over to the corner where your friend is, and that's because they're moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And so that's exactly what happens with this gradient. Carbon dioxide is getting into the surface of the ocean, and then now we're talking about, okay, what stops it from just kind of bouncing right back out? And that is something called the carbonate buffering system. And this is different from what I referenced in the previous slide, which is the carbonate pump. So I want us to sort of put the carbonate pump out of our minds for now. And we're going to talk about the carbonate buffering system. And this is basically just a series of chemical reactions that happens in water. And carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is particularly kind of dangerous because it doesn't react with anything else. It stays there. It doesn't combine with other molecules to form something completely different. It stays as carbon dioxide when it's in that gaseous state. But when carbon dioxide is dissolved in water, just like in soda, it tends to react with that water really quickly. And the reaction that you're seeing in front of you is almost instantaneous, which I think is just super neat. And there's nothing causing this to happen, no outside influence, other than the fact that the ocean wants to stay, as most things in the world do, it wants to stay at equilibrium. Basically doesn't want things to change. It's just like your body. Bodies want to stay in sort of what's called homeostasis. Things we don't, in a sort of basic sense, everything in the universe is always resisting change. And that's no different with the oceans. And this particular equation is driven by a desire, well, not a desire, because the ocean is not alive in this sense, but the need for the ocean to maintain the same level of acidity. And acidity is, when we talk about acids and bases, it has to do with potentially how corrosive something is. That's just a sort of simple way of thinking of it. But what acidity really is, when you get down to the basics, it's just the amount of hydrogen ions floating around in a solution. And the hydrogen ions are the things that you see on the screen typed H+. It's basically just one single molecule of proton and or molecule of hydrogen, and all that's actually in that molecule is a proton, just one single proton. And that is what makes the ocean and makes anything acidic. And so when you pump this carbon dioxide into the ocean, in order to maintain a basic level of acidity, the carbon dioxide is going to react with water. And when you combine all of those numbers together in this equation, forms something called carbonic acid. And that's what's in the green here. And the names don't quite matter. But then immediately after carbonic acid is formed, it dissolves in water that is continuously, there's an unlimited supply of water. And so this carbonic acid, even though there was water used up to combine with carbon dioxide, the water continues to dissolve the carbonic acid and splits it up into HCO3 minus, and then another free hydrogen, which is that proton that I was talking about. And that's what makes it an acid, carbonic acid, because it's allowed to split up into this H plus ion. And then because there's even more water around, bicarbonate splits up again, and there's another hydrogen ion that gets released. And then what's left is carbonate, which is CO3 2 minus. And you don't really need to know much about chemistry to basically understand that when CO2 enters the ocean from the left side of this equation to the right side, the whole process releases 2 hydrogen ions, and that's those H plus. And the 2 hydrogen ions that get released make the ocean more acidic. And that's what happens when we're talking about ocean acidification. And I wonder if many of us have heard of ocean acidification when talking about coral reefs, for example. The process of the ocean absorbing carbon dioxide, then releasing these hydrogen ions, is what ends up changing what we call the pH of the ocean. And pH is a way of describing how acidic or not acidic a solution is, and a solution just being something that is liquid. And over time, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the ocean has taken up so much carbon dioxide, and this equation has happened so many billions and trillions of times that the overall pH has shifted about 25%, and it's gotten lower, which means it's gotten more acidic. So the overall ocean since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution has gotten about a quarter more acidic. And that is where the question of effects on wildlife really comes in. And this system, the reason that it stores carbon dioxide is because of its efforts to maintain the same pH. And so what the ocean wants is not to release these 2 hydrogen ions. It wants to release as few as possible in order to maintain that same pH. And so that means that most of the carbon dioxide in the ocean gets stored as that middle substance, bicarbonate. And that's what allows the ocean to stay in equilibrium. And this is a diagram of what's actually happening with ocean acidification. The green line represents the concentration of that bicarbonate ion. And as you increase acidity, meaning decrease the pH, the amount of carbon dioxide that the ocean can absorb is less. It basically drives this equation all the way to the reverse. So this is what is the sort of scary part of the presentation, in that the ocean can actually only absorb so much of the carbon dioxide that's pumped into the atmosphere because of the fact that it wants to maintain this equilibrium. And so at lower pHs, the more CO2 we pump in, the more this equation gets driven all the way to the right side. The more hydrogen ions get released, the more acidic it gets. And when things are really acidic, the ocean is unhappy. It wants to have those hydrogen ions bind to anything that it can. And so it's going to say, okay, we're done. I can't do this equation anymore. We're not even going to dissolve this carbonic acid anymore. And if the carbonic acid can't dissolve into those bicarbonate ions and carbonate ions, then the equation basically stops. It stops as soon as carbon dioxide tries to enter the atmosphere. And it basically changes that gradient that we were talking about in the first place. And it makes it so that, when the ocean is saying, okay, no more of this equation, we're done, the pH is too low, we can't do this equation anymore. And that also means that the concentration of carbon dioxide on the surface of the ocean is just, as we say about rent, it's just too damn high. And that means that we are not going to let any more in. The gates are closed. And that is what becomes really sort of dangerous about, continuing to burn fossil fuels, continuing to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, is that the ocean can only take so much. And so, there comes a point at which if the pH gets too low, we kind of shut down the whole operation. And we have a long ways to go. The current pH of the ocean is about 8.14, so sort of right in the middle of that blue line on this graph. And as you can see by the arrow, the expected change is trending towards the ocean becoming more acidic, so becoming less and less able to absorb carbon dioxide. And that's bad news for more than one reason. But before I get there, isn't that what might have happened to the Dead Sea in terms of, I'm not quite sure what you're referencing. Are you referencing it not being able to absorb anything else? And feel free to just type that in the chat.
Yes.
Okay. My understanding with the Dead Sea is that it didn't have to do with carbon dioxide, but what it had to do with salt. And that is the same thing that happens when you basically pour a bunch of salt into, if I poured a ton of salt into this water, if I did a little teaspoon at first and mixed it around a lot, I could get the salt to dissolve so that we wouldn't be able to see it anymore. But then if I just kept piling it in and piling it in and piling it in, eventually there would be no room left, not physically, but between the molecules of water. There would be no more molecules of water left to bind to those salt molecules. And that, when that happens, when you just have too much in a space in order to dissolve it anymore, that is called reaching saturation. So that means that the space, the solution that you're trying to dissolve something in basically loses its capacity to dissolve anymore. And that's what happened with the Dead Sea. And that basically means that there's no more water left. There's just too much salt. So that's actually a really, I like that analogy for what the potential is for carbon dioxide, in that it just reaches a saturation point. It just can't take anymore and it can't dissolve anymore. And so the ocean wouldn't dry up in the same way, but what it would do is it would stop being able to take in carbon dioxide. And in some instances, it might even shoot some carbon dioxide back out, which we really don't want. So now we're going to get into some cool biology stuff. And that has to do with this friend on the left. And this is a tiny little microorganism. Can't really see it with your eye, but it's everywhere in the ocean, just absolutely everywhere. And its shells, these little discs, each one is a piece of its shell. And inside that sphere is where its actual, sort of soft body parts are, where it's, as it doesn't quite have organs the way that we do, but that's where its insides are. And the outside is hard. It's made of calcium carbonate. And I think that the most interesting thing about these guys are called coccolithophores. The most interesting thing about coccolithophores is that calcium carbonate from coccolithophores is the original chalk. It's what the White Cliffs of Dover are made of. It piles up, and humans used to use that type of chalk before we figured out how to make our own calcium carbonate to write. And I think that that's pretty neat. And what a great word. Can you spell that? Yes, absolutely. I'm going to type that in the chat. There you go, coccolithophore. And coccolithophores, even though they may not look like it, they're just algae. They photosynthesize, they eat a lot of carbon dioxide, but then they end up pooping it back out when they're broken down. But what happens with coccolithophores and with a lot of organisms in the ocean is that what I said before about how they get eaten by bigger organisms. The bigger organisms poop them out. the poop sink to the bottom of the ocean, and the carbon that's stored in the poop from the coccolithophores in the first place goes way to the bottom of the ocean where it's trapped. And sometimes, we don't even make it through the process of getting eaten and then pooped out. Sometimes these guys just die, and it's called marine snow when there's, they're heavy enough to sink. And that marine snow lands on the bottom of the ocean floor. And this is what takes a pretty long time to happen. But only about 1 to 2% of, the photosynthesizing algae in the surface of the ocean ever end up making it to the bottom of the ocean. But that is still enough to have a measurable impact on, long-term carbon sequestration, which is basically, sequestration is just another word for trapping. Because when it gets to the bottom of the ocean, it's going to take a really long time for it to get anywhere close to the atmosphere again, so that it would, affect atmospheric concentrations once more. And if it stays down in the bottom of the ocean long enough, it gets what's called lithified, as in it gets turned into rock. It gets turned into limestone, which is the White Cliffs of Dover. And so that's sort of a long-term picture of this process happening in a way that doesn't just allow the carbon dioxide to sit in the water column, but traps it, just in the same way that trees store carbon in their trunks long term. So this is what we really want to make sure is still able to happen in the ocean. And this can't happen if the ocean can't even absorb any more carbon dioxide. Okay. So this is actually just a little bit of what I just talked about, in that there's long-term time scales to this whole system, and there's also short time scales to this whole system. And the shorter time scale stuff is that solubility reaction where the ocean is absorbing carbon dioxide, it's chilling in the surface, and then it gets pumped down into the interior, or the middle, the deeper parts of the ocean, where it stays for a longer time because it's stored in that bicarbonate form through the carbonate buffering system. It's stored as that middle form. And that's really quick. The movement and the storage is longer, just as the floating and that marine snow takes a little bit of a longer time too. Okay, and so now we're kind of getting to the conclusion of, what is the overall impact sort of numerically on the global amount of carbon that sort of exists in the atmosphere. And that amount is called the global carbon budget. It's basically how much is added, or our paycheck of carbon, except for that this is a bad paycheck. How much carbon is added in our paycheck, and then how much do we spend? And the fossil fuel combustion is an addition, and so our emissions from land use change, and that means chopping down forests for building materials, for development, and those are sort of the two main global factors that increase emissions in the atmosphere. So those are the paycheck, and then on the other side we've also got the sinks. So the paycheck is the sources, the sinks are what we spend it on, and the main sinks are the atmosphere, which we know because the concentration of carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, which we don't want. But what has mediated that increase, what has made it be not so giant, is just what we talked about, the amount going into the ocean, and then in a pretty equal amount, the carbon dioxide that gets absorbed by plants on land. So we've got these two systems, the ocean and trees and plants working together to make sure that not all of our emissions end up in the atmosphere immediately. And so that sort of equals this nice number, which is that currently, we still have a little bit of room left to go where the ocean can absorb carbon dioxide still, even though throughout history, since the Industrial Revolution, it's been absorbing about 1/3 of all of our carbon emissions every single year. And the end result is a really big number. And because the ocean has so much biological life that eats carbon dioxide for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just like those coccolithophores. And because of this buffering system and these pumps that sort of suck the carbon dioxide down into the middle of the ocean, that has ended us up with the ocean storing 95% of all of the carbon that exists on Earth. And you can see that in a couple of the numbers here. This is the carbon budget that we just saw on the last slide, but with numbers added to it, with sources and sinks, and natural sources and human sources. And so the red is human mediated sources, the black is natural sources and sinks, and vice versa. And so the ocean stores about 38,000 petagrams. So we can just say 38,000. And the atmosphere has 589. And every year it's increasing by about 4. And so 38,000 is about 50 times bigger than 589, which I think is just incredible. Just the fact that, if we didn't have this system, which, takes into account chemistry, biology, physics, all sorts of incredible things working for us, then the atmospheric concentration of CO2 would be at least 150 parts per million greater than it is today, which would mean multiple degrees of temperature change greater than what we've got. And so I think, we've got to thank the ocean for giving us a little more time, I think. So that's where we end. And I've got a couple more minutes for questions, and I'm seeing one from Bill, which is, how is the increased surface area of the oceans due to melting ice going to change the balance? That's a complex question, because we don't actually know how much ice is going to melt. That and one of the interesting pieces of that question also has to do with how much of the ice that is going to melt, that's basically stored in ice sheets in Antarctica, is actually lying over the ocean. And the answer is that a lot of it isn't. A lot of it is actually, kilometers deep sheets of ice that that are actually over land that is buried. And Antarctica isn't just sheets of ice. And so we don't even know, because those ice sheets are so thick, we don't know how much of the ice is, sitting on top of and floating on top of water versus how much of it is sitting on top of land. And so we can't answer the question of how much extra surface area is going to be exposed on the ocean. And so there's definitely a lot of room for additional research about that. But one of the interesting things about the effects on wildlife, which I promised I would get to, is that we also don't quite have an answer for that. Some coccolithophores have adapted so that in more acidic areas, they just build thicker shells. And whereas for some organisms, the acidity dissolves their shells, there are certain species of coccolithophores that just build on more armor. And their coccolithophores are incredibly diverse. There are over 200 species of coccolithophores, and some of them are more vulnerable than others. But when it comes to other organisms like fish, plankton, seashells, for example, and coral, pretty much all of the effects of ocean acidification and increased emissions, causing that are negative. And there's, not to end on a sort of sour note, but the ocean carbon cycle has a really big influence because it has to do with the sort of smallest pieces of the food chain that go all the way up to fish. And big organisms can affect the global food chain for humans as well. And that includes a lot of the global economy. And all of that is really dependent on, allowing species to survive and thrive in the ocean as they are right now. And biodiversity has already decreased a lot in the oceans. And so that sort of lends extra urgency to the climate crisis. Lynn asked, there must be a difference between the CO2 sequestered in the ocean substrate versus dissolved in the water column in terms of saturation. Can you describe this difference and their relative contributions to the CO2 sink? Do you mean the sequestered in the ocean substrate as in buried geologically? Sort of what we talked about lithified? Yes. Yeah, there isn't, I mean, the CO2 that gets dissolved in the water column is much more abundant in deeper areas of the ocean than it is in the surface because of those drawdown effects. And the relative contributions to the CO2 sink, they work in concert. The burial and long-term carbon sequestration, because of lithification, is only about 1 to 2% of, as in only 1 to 2% of all of the biomass that exists in the surface of the ocean ends up making it to the bottom. And so it's a relatively small amount in terms of its total impact on CO2 sinks, but it's one of the best ways that we have to do that long-term sequestration. But the majority of sequestered carbon that's, it's on shorter timescales than that sedimentation and burial, but it still stays in the ocean for a really long time. Is the, as you've said, the CO2 dissolved in the water column.
Thanks, Ari.
Sure. And then Judy, I think this might have to be our last question. Asked, will the CO2 stored in the oceans be released into the atmosphere in the future and worsen climate change? That is definitely something that I think worries many climate scientists, and is a sort of a two-pronged question, because CO2 is stored in the oceans in many different ways. And if we're talking about this particular mechanism, if we go back to that pH graph, once we get below a pH of 6.35 is really the number where the direction of that equation changes, where the carbonate buffering system equation direction changes. And at that point, there is definitely the potential for a massive outgassing of carbon dioxide from the ocean, because it would be a reverse of that reaction, and right on the left side is CO2. So it would say, okay, we're going to inject all this carbon dioxide so that we can bring the ocean back to chemical equilibrium. We can bring it back to a neutral pH. There's a really long way to go before that could ever happen. I don't know the sort of how likely it is, but I'm not. I certainly haven't done any specific research on this, but I would guess that it wouldn't happen in our lifetimes, if not, many hundreds or thousands of years. And that's if, we don't deal with stuff and decrease our emissions. But then there's one other really, really fascinating thing. I think this is why I said it was a two-pronged question, because when I started the presentation, I was talking just sort of really briefly about methane. And methane has a significant role to play in all of this. Not so much the pump systems, but in what's going to happen in the future as the ocean warms. And methane can be stored in ice, similar to the way that CO2 can be, but in a sort of a different form, in what's called a methane clathrate hydrate. And global warming, temperature change because of climate change, has the potential to melt a lot of what's called permafrost, which is what, in normal conditions would be permanently frozen ice that stores big bubbles of methane. And that would release a really, really massive amount of methane into the atmosphere. So that's one of the sort of pieces of the feedback cycle of climate change that we really want to try to avoid.
Thank you so much, Ari. And really, honestly, I didn't have to facilitate anything. So you were so able, and this was such an informative presentation. Thank you. To the
Thanks.
audience, this would be your chance if you want to use your voice to ask questions to Ari. Now is the time to do so.
Thank you very much.
Ari,
Thanks, Christine.
I have a question about methane and how potent it is, because I hear there's something like, well, there's a certain number for now, but then over a certain amount of time,
Yep.
it's much greater, and that's the number we really should be using. Can you explain that?
Yes, I can explain that. I have a major gripe with the way that a lot of scientists and environmental organizations talk about how potent climate methane is relative to carbon dioxide. And the difference is, we'll talk about it from a 20-year standpoint and a 100-year standpoint. From a 20-year standpoint, if you're saying, okay, if we're only thinking from now until 2040, methane, the number is about 84, and that's on the short scale. But then as methane continues to exist in the atmosphere, its potency declines, and that is because of what's called the residence time or lifetime of various chemical compounds in the atmosphere. And the lifetime of methane in the atmosphere is only about 10 years. And so when you have an initial pulse, it's sort of strength in increasing global warming, in basically not allowing sunlight to escape from the earth, trapping heat, is greatest on the short time scale. But then because methane tends to react with a whole bunch of other stuff in the atmosphere, it can, when methane is released into the atmosphere, it reacts with sunlight to form ozone, which is smog. That is what helps sort of decrease the amount of time that it actually spends in the atmosphere. And because it has a shorter lifetime, then its efficacy and efficiency as a greenhouse gas ends up declining in the long term. And that's all relative to carbon dioxide. And, on a 100-year time scale, which is what we kind of should be measuring, because that's the residence time / lifetime of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If we're comparing methane to carbon dioxide, we need to use the carbon dioxide's lifetime. And so on a 100-year time scale, the potency of methane relative to carbon dioxide is about 29 times more. So what I basically do whenever I'm talking about methane and those numbers is be very specific, which it sounds like has potentially been frustrating or confusing. And when you see that 84 number, assume 20 years. When you see the 29 or 30 number, assume 100 years.
Okay, so you don't like the fact that they use that the environmentalists use a smaller number as far as the potency of methane?
I don't like that they use it without context.
Okay.
It's an important number because we don't have 100 years to deal with this.
Right.
We don't even have 20. But when we're using that number, we need to make sure that we're not using scare tactics, unreasonably, without explaining why it's so scary. It's okay to it's a scary thing. We should be scared. But if we don't lend proper context to it, then I don't think that that's fair.
Thank you again.
Thanks, Christine.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ari. Again, wonderful presentation. Loved having you for Naturalist Hour. And to my wonderful audience, thank you for being here and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
You, Ari. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Sarnella. Bye.